Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video and commenting where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into these chilling stories. I was on a road trip alone, just trying to get from LA to the northern part of California. It was around midnight, maybe a little later, and I had planned to stop at some small town for the night, but the rain hit hard. I couldn't see a thing, and I mean that literally. The windshield wipers barely worked, and the rain was so heavy that I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. I was on some long stretch of highway, nothing but black road, trees on both sides, and thick fog rolling over everything. You know how sometimes it feels like you're the only person alive on Earth? That's what it felt like, except, well, I wasn't alone. I was trying to drive through it. I didn't have much of a choice. I could pull over and wait, but I'd done that already, and it didn't help. The rain didn't seem like it was going to let up anytime soon, and the road, it just went on, like some kind of endless nightmare. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought it was just some weird shadow, but then I realized it was a person. A guy, standing right on the side of the road. I couldn't believe it. Who in their right mind would be standing out here in the rain this late? It didn't make any sense. I slowed down, my heart starting to race. I was maybe 10 feet away when I saw the guy more clearly. He looked like he'd been out there a while, soaking wet, his clothes all stuck to him. His face, God, his face was pale, almost sickly, like he hadn't slept or eaten in days. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and he had this weird look in his eyes, like he was both desperate and totally calm at the same time. The worst part, he was standing on the shoulder of the road, waving me down, like he was waiting for someone to stop. My gut told me not to. It was a feeling you can't ignore. But I'm a sucker for that kind of thing. Maybe it's the good part of me, maybe it's just stupidity. Either way, I pulled over. I rolled the window down a crack. "Hey, you need a ride?" I asked, trying to sound friendly, like I wasn't already regretting this. The man didn't respond at first. He just kept staring at me with those wide, almost vacant eyes. His lips barely moved as he mumbled, "It's not safe out here." "Yeah, I get that," I said. "Where are you headed?" The man didn't answer directly. Instead, he looked over his shoulder like he was checking for something. He was shaking, whether from cold or nerves, I couldn't tell. I need to get to the next town," he said finally. His voice was hoarse, like he hadn't talked in forever. I hesitated for a second. I should have just driven off, but I didn't. I don't know why. Something about him just made me feel uneasy, but not dangerous uneasy. More like an odd sense of urgency. I wasn't sure why, but I figured what the hell. It's just a guy needing a ride. I unlocked the door and he climbed in without saying a word. I tried to keep the conversation going, just to fill the silence, but he barely responded. When he did, his answers were short, one-word things. "Yeah, no. Just need to get there." It was strange, but I let it go. The rain was making it even harder to focus, and the road was empty, like the rest of the world had just disappeared. I wanted to get this over with and find somewhere safe to pull off. The further we went, the worse the rain got. The windshield wipers were working overtime, but they couldn't clear away the sheets of water crashing against the glass. The headlights barely pierced through the fog, and the road felt more and more deserted. It was like the world was slowly shrinking, the spaces between us closing in. I kept glancing over at the man. He hadn't moved much, just staring ahead, his hands folded in his lap. He smelled like wet clothes and something else. Something musty, like old wood, but not quite. His eyes, though, they never left the road. He didn't seem afraid or anything. In fact, he looked too calm, almost too still. I felt something shifting in my chest, a tight knot of unease. Why was he so quiet? Why wasn't he trying to talk, to make small talk? or at least seem a little less distant. It wasn't until I passed a road sign that I realized how far out of the way I'd gone. I didn't even recognize the name of the town listed on it. Something about that hit me hard. That's when I decided it was time to drop him off. I couldn't explain it, but I needed to get rid of him. Now. Where exactly do you need to go? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I'm not sure how much farther I can go in this weather. The man didn't respond right away. I could see his hands tightening into fists. Just keep going, he muttered. I didn't want to, but I kept driving. The road started to twist and turn, and before I knew it, we were on a narrower path surrounded by trees. That's when it hit me. I don't remember any of this. I don't remember this part of the highway, and I should. I had driven this route before. Everything felt wrong. The rain was pounding harder, the windshield wipers screeching as they struggled to keep up. My headlights were barely cutting through the night. There was a strange pressure building in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. I didn't see it coming. Out of nowhere, the man grabbed the side of my seat with one hand and jerked the door handle with the other. I didn't have time to react. My head slammed against the window, and I heard a hiss of air as the door shot open. A cold gust of wind and rain rushed in. Before I could even move, he was there, his arm around my neck, a knife, shiny, glinting in the dim light, pressed to my throat. "Give me everything," he whispered, his voice cold, calm, and utterly devoid of emotion. Now. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. It all happened so fast. I fumbled for my wallet, my phone, anything that might get me out of this. My mind raced, but everything in my hands felt like it was slipping away. "Now!" he repeated, pushing the blade harder into my skin. I handed him my wallet, my phone, everything. My fingers were shaking. I could feel the cold of the knife, and for a second, I thought he might just end it right there. Then, as suddenly as it started, he let go. I turned my head just enough to see him disappear into the rain, vanishing into the night like he had never been there at all. The truck was still running, the wipers still moving, but I was in shock. Completely paralyzed. I didn't know if I should stay or leave, but I had no choice. I drove away. Fast. I don't remember where I was heading or what happened next. I just drove. I never found him again. I went to the police, but they couldn't find any trace of him. No one had seen anyone on that stretch of road. The rain had washed everything away, and I couldn't even describe what he looked like clearly. He was just a blur of pale skin and wet clothes, eyes too wide, too blank. I thought about the night a lot. Too much. Too much. Every time I drive that highway, I see his face in my rearview mirror. Every time the rain falls too hard, I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for the next person to come along. There's something wrong about picking up a stranger on a dark, rainy night. Something sinister, something you can't even understand until it's too late. So, next time you're driving down a quiet highway at night and see someone standing by the side of the road, don't stop. It was a Wednesday night, and I just finished my shift at a small restaurant in downtown San Francisco. It had been a long day, lots of orders, grumpy customers, and the kind of stress that comes with working in a busy place until midnight. By the time I stepped outside, the rain was coming down in sheets. I could feel it soaking into my coat, dripping off the sleeves, the pavement glistening in the dim glow of the streetlights. I hated walking home this late. I only lived a few blocks away, but the streets were practically deserted at that hour. It didn't help that I always had this nagging feeling that something might be off. I was used to the quiet after hours. I've lived in the city for years now, so you get used to walking home alone at night. But tonight, something felt different. Something felt wrong. I started walking down the street, the sound of my shoes slapping the wet pavement echoing in the silence. It's not like there was anyone else around, just the occasional car whizzing by, its headlights slicing through the rain. The city was alive with noise in other places, but here it was empty, quiet, except for one thing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At first, I thought I was just being paranoid. It's what you do when you're alone at night, right? You start to imagine things, you hear things that aren't really there. But I couldn't ignore it. I could feel the weight of someone watching me. It was like the hairs on the back of my neck were standing up and my footsteps were echoing back to me a little too loudly. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just the shadows, the rain, the late hour getting to me. But then I heard it. Footsteps. They were behind me. Just a little too quiet, like someone was trying to be discreet, but not quite managing it. It wasn't a car driving by or the sound of someone's music coming from a nearby building. No, these footsteps were the kind that matched mine exactly. The rhythm, the distance. Someone was following me. I quickened my pace. I didn't look back because I didn't want to look back. You know that feeling when you're afraid to see something? But even though I didn't look, I knew. I knew someone was there. The steps behind me stayed consistent. They didn't slow down or speed up, just kept that steady pace like they were waiting for the right moment to close the distance. My heart started to race. I felt stupid for not calling someone when I first noticed it. I should have called my roommate or my mom or even my friend Karen. But instead, I kept walking, pretending like everything was fine, pretending I wasn't being stalked. I turned the corner onto a quieter street, hoping to lose whoever was following me in the maze of alleyways and parked cars. But the steps followed, always just a few paces behind. That's when it clicked. They weren't random footsteps. They were synchronized with mine. I wasn't just being paranoid anymore. Someone was definitely tailing me. I wanted to run, but something kept me moving at the same pace. I think part of me hoped it was just my imagination. Another part was just frozen, scared. I tried to focus on something, anything, to distract myself. I counted the cracks in the sidewalk. I looked at the raindrops splattering against the streetlights. But that feeling, that horrible feeling, stayed with me. I could still hear them, the footsteps. Even as I approached my building, they stayed right behind me. I finally reached the building, fumbling with my keys as I turned to look behind me. I didn't want to, but I couldn't help it. I had to know if I was imagining things, and that's when I saw him. He was standing across the street, just behind a parked car. I couldn't see his face, but his figure was unmistakable. Tall, slender, staring at me. I felt my stomach drop into my feet. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel them, burning right through me. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. For a second, I thought I was imagining it. That maybe I had been walking too fast, and he'd just been going the same direction. But the way he stood there, unmoving, staring at me from the shadows, it was too intentional to be a coincidence. I rushed inside the building, my heart racing, my hands shaking as I slammed the door behind me. I locked it quickly and stumbled into the elevator, still trying to calm my racing thoughts. My apartment was just 2 floors up, but it felt like an eternity before I was finally inside. I locked every door. I double-checked the windows. I pulled the curtains shut just to make sure I couldn't see anything in the street outside. I don't even know why. I didn't think he was still there, but the feeling was still lingering, like he was watching me from the shadows. I tried to go to bed, but I couldn't sleep. My mind kept racing, my heart thudding in my chest. I wanted to call the cops, but what could I say? That some guy had been following me for a few blocks and then stood across the street staring at me? It didn't seem like enough. It didn't seem like a reason to involve the police. Not yet, at least. So I stayed up all night, sitting on my couch with my phone in hand, checking the door every few minutes, hoping that this was just a weird coincidence and that he wouldn't be outside when I woke up. But it didn't stop. Not the next day. Not the day after. Over the next few days, I noticed him again. Not every day, but enough times for me to feel like I wasn't imagining things. He was always in the same spot across the street, behind a different car, or standing just far enough in the shadows that I couldn't get a good look at him. One evening, when I was heading out for another late shift, I saw him standing there again. This time, I wasn't going to let it slide. I grabbed my phone, snapped a quick picture of him from inside my apartment window, and sent it to my roommate. "You're not going to believe this, but I think someone's been following me for days now. This guy. I swear he's stalking me." She immediately told me to call the cops. I didn't want to, but she was right. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I dialed the number, trying to keep my voice steady. The police showed up shortly after, and I showed them the picture I'd taken. They said they'd look into it, but part of me wasn't convinced they'd do anything. But then something happened that I didn't expect. The officer knocked on my door the next day to tell me they had caught him. He was in custody, and they were questioning him about his behavior. Apparently, he had been stalking me for weeks, watching my every move, waiting for me to get home from work so he could get close. I was horrified to find out who he was. It wasn't just some random guy off the street. It was Zach, one of the cooks from the restaurant where I worked. I'd never thought much of him. He was always quiet, never made much small talk. But he'd been obsessed with me for weeks. The officers told me he'd been following me every time I left work, taking notes on my routine, even showing up outside my apartment in the dead of night. They arrested him right after that. He was charged with stalking, and it turns out he had done this to other women in the past, though they never caught him until now. The worst part? I had worked side by side with him for months, thinking he was just another guy doing his job. I moved out of that apartment a few weeks later. I couldn't stay there, not after knowing what had been going on. The thought of him watching me all those nights right outside my window, it makes my skin crawl just thinking about it. If something feels off, trust that feeling. Don't ignore it. Don't second guess it. You never know when you might be walking right into something you'll never forget. It was a rainy night in California, somewhere off the beaten path. I had just left a friend's house after an impromptu dinner, and I was heading back to my apartment. The rain was coming down in sheets, the kind that makes it impossible to see more than a few feet in front of you. The wipers were working overtime, and even with my headlights on full, the road was a blur of wet pavement and distorted street signs. I wasn't in any rush. I had nothing pressing to get back to, but I did want to get home before it got any later. The drive was taking longer than usual, though. I was on some winding back road far from the main highways, and I could barely see any signs of civilization. It was just me, the road, and the sound of the rain. But then I saw him. There was a man standing on the side of the road, just barely visible through the rain. He was waving his arms, trying to get someone's attention. At first, I thought he might be a pedestrian in need of help, someone who'd gotten stuck or stranded in the downpour. I hesitated for a second. I don't know why. I think I was just thrown off guard by the sight of anyone out here at this hour, in this weather. But then, something in me decided to stop. I pulled over, rolling down my window just enough to hear him. I wasn't sure if I should have done it, but I didn't think much of it at the time. "Hey, you all right?" I called out, trying to sound calm, despite my nerves. The man approached the window. He was drenched, his clothes stuck to his skin, water dripping from his hair. I couldn't make out his face too well, but he looked like someone who had been outside in this storm far too long. "Yeah," he said, his voice shaky. "My car broke down. I was hoping someone would stop." He glanced over his shoulder at the dark stretch of road behind him. "I've been here for a while. I tried calling for help, but my phone's dead. Could you give me a ride to the nearest gas station? It's just up the road. I wasn't sure why, but I felt a little relieved. I mean, I don't know why I trusted him, but something in me didn't question it. Maybe it was just that urge to help someone out in need. Maybe it was because I knew how terrible it was to be stranded alone on a rainy night with no one around. Yeah, sure, I said, unlocking the passenger side door. Hop in. It's not safe out here. He nodded, quickly getting in. I could tell he was cold, shivering, and his hands were still wet from the rain. I didn't think much of it at the time, but later I'd realized that was a sign I should have noticed. There was no way he could have been out there that long without being colder than he was. He thanked me, and I could tell he was grateful, or at least seemed that way. I tried to keep the conversation light, just small talk to ease the tension. So, where are you headed? I asked. Just a few miles down the road, he said, wiping his face with his sleeve. There's a small gas station, like I said. I'll be fine once I get there. I just need to warm up for a minute. I didn't think much of it. I was just glad I could help. It's not like he seemed dangerous. He didn't even act desperate or anything, just tired and wet. But as we drove down the road, the atmosphere in the car changed. The silence between us started to feel uncomfortable, almost like I was sensing something I couldn't place. I kept glancing at him out of the corner of my eye, but he was just staring out the window, lost in his thoughts. At one point, I noticed his hands, which were still gripping the seat tightly. He kept adjusting his position, like he was trying to get more comfortable, but it didn't seem normal. It was subtle, but it started to feel like something was off. "Are you sure you're all right?" I asked, trying to make sure he wasn't getting worse from the cold. He gave a small, tight smile. "Yeah, just need to warm up. Thanks for the ride." But the smile didn't reach his eyes. They were too intense, too focused. Something about his expression started to unsettle me. It was just a few minutes after that when things took a turn. We were on a stretch of road with no streetlights. The rain was still coming down hard, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up. I could barely see anything in the distance. That's when he spoke up again, his voice lower this time. "I think you should pull over," he said, his tone suddenly colder. I frowned. "What? Why?" "There's a good spot just ahead," he insisted. "Just pull over." I didn't understand why, but I felt like I should listen to him. Something in his voice made me hesitate. Maybe it was the way he said it, almost like an order. Against my better judgment, I slowed the car and turned off the main road into a narrower, darker street. I figured it was a quick way to get to the gas station, but as I made the turn, I felt the air in the car shift. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the unease I had been feeling was growing stronger. When I finally stopped, the man didn't say anything. He didn't even look at me. Instead, he opened the door and stepped out of the car, his shoes splashing in the puddles. The rain poured down over him, but he didn't seem to care. And then, with a sudden movement, he leaned into the car from the outside, tapping on my window. I rolled down the window, but before I could say anything, he looked me directly in the eyes, his expression cold and deliberate. "I could take your car right now," he said, his voice eerily calm. The words hit me like a slap, cold and harsh. My blood ran cold. I didn't know what to say. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper as panic began to claw its way into my chest. He didn't answer. Instead, I suddenly felt the cold press of something hard against my side. At first, I didn't know what it was. Then I saw it, the faint outline of a knife beneath his jacket, the blade pressed against me, just under the window. "I'm taking your car," he said again, the words slow, deliberate, almost bored. "Now, get out." I froze. The adrenaline hit me all at once, but I couldn't move. My hands shook against the steering wheel. I wanted to scream, but my mouth was dry. But then, something inside me snapped. Without thinking, I slammed my foot down on the gas. The car lurched forward, tires screeching as I tore away from him, the engine roaring in the night. I didn't look back. I couldn't afford to. All I could think of was putting as much distance between me and that man as possible. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest well-lit area, several blocks down. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911, but I managed to get through and explain what had happened. I was still trying to catch my breath, still shaken from the experience. The dispatcher stayed calm, asking me questions to get more information. A police officer showed up shortly after, and I gave them my statement, still in shock. They promised they would look into it, but after that night, I never heard anything else from the police. I don't know if they ever caught him or if he's still out there. All I know is that experience changed everything. I'll never look at a simple offer to help the same way again. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.